All right. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Grace United Methodist Church. So my name is Peter Donald Park. I'm pastor of this church. We are blessed and delighted to have you here. And today's event is the very first and so grand opening of Grace Talks. Which is Grace UMC's public lecture series where we invite, inspire, and encourage our community members. So in these quarterly public presentations, Grace Talks, we learn, interpret, and discuss our experiences at home, work, and in our community. So we will be asking, what challenges do we face as parents, spouses, employees, and community members? What are Christian ways to respond responsibly and with integrity to these challenges? Through this time, we not only gain new knowledge and insight, but also share our struggles in a safe environment. Today, we are honored and privileged to have Chow. Am I? Yes. Saying the name, properly. That's important, right? So we are privileged and honored to have Chow as our featured guest and speaker. Claire is a marriage and family therapist who has practiced in the San Ramon area for 30 years with a specialization in grief and cross-cultural issues. She has led many grief groups and taught about this subject to graduate students. Ms. Chow is a longtime member of Linus United Methodist Church in Pleasanton. Who's from Linus? Yay! Right. And the title of today's talk is Learning About and Learning From Grief. But before we begin, let me say a few words of thanks to Claire. When I was thinking of this event, Grace Talks, and as I said, this is the first event, first Grace Talks we ever had. So when I was thinking of this event and how to invite and serve our community, I was not sure where to start. I had ideas, but I needed a real person. Your speaker who would come and share his or her ideas, experiences, and inspirations. I even wondered, can this really happen? Then in a conversation with a member of my church, her name came up and her expertise, and I said, why don't we invite her? And Claire graciously accepted the invitation, and when I found out she's going to come, I told myself, thank God. Thank God, this is really happening. For your willingness to come and share, Claire, I want to thank God and thank you. So now, let's welcome today's speaker, Claire Chow.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am very privileged to be here and such an incredible welcome from the pastor. I feel quite honored. The topic we have tonight is not a cheerful one in a sense, but it's one that all of us live with on an ongoing basis. As you talked about, it's a question, how does a faith community respond? How do we help each other? How do we help ourselves? How do we help our family members? So what I'd like to do is just give you some information tonight, but I'm also open to questions and comments. So this isn't a formal lecture. If you have a question that occurs to you, please raise your hand and we will have time for discussion also. So I want to talk about grief today. Again, Pastor gave a very good introduction. And I'd like us to start with holding somebody for this hour in our hearts as we approach this topic. It's easy to think about grief as something out there, but I think if we can really put that topic with a person or a situation, I think it will have more meaning. So for me personally, I'm holding the memory of my mother, who had a very incredible life, and this is one of the parts of grief where I am now starting to realize there are things I wish I had asked her, there are things I wish I had known more about her life, that as she was living you always think, okay, there's more time I can find about that later. And I'm going through old photo albums, and who is this person and who is that person? So that's part of how that grief is ongoing. If you can each think of somebody that you can carry tonight, and if anyone wants to say a name out loud, I would welcome that, but if that's just something you want to have in your heart, that would be fine. Okay, I'm going to start out by talking about some myths about grief. The first myth is that grief is what happens when someone dies. Those of us who have been doing this work for a long time really want us to think about grief as a reaction to any significant loss that you might have. So it isn't, you usually hear on the news, such and such a person died and people are grieving, and that's about all you hear. But has anyone here retired? Has anyone here moved significantly far away from where they were? Has anyone here divorced? Has anyone here had a significant health setback where the things that you're used to doing you can't do anymore? Okay, so all of these things are grief. That is a natural reaction to significant loss. I find sometimes as a therapist it's useful to tell people, I think you're grieving. So if somebody says, I just retired and I thought my life was going to be so great and I was going to be on the golf course all day and this was just going to be wonderful, but I'm feeling kind of disoriented. I didn't think I'd feel this way. I could say, you might be grieving and not really had expected that. Everything that was known to you before. You go into work every day. One of my clients even told me what she misses, she didn't even think about this, is even though those people at work are not necessarily your close friends, you see them every day. You're so used to having them around. You sit at the lunch table with them. They ask you about your trips and stuff, and now you simply don't have those people at all anymore. It's stuff you don't even think about. So those are some kinds of losses. I'll share a story, even something as simple as moving from one place to another. We tend to think about all the great things that are going to happen in the new place, but we forget that there's grief in losing the old place too. So we had a story where Jim and I and our two kids moved just really literally 2 blocks away to a bigger house. So it was, the same neighborhood, the same schools, everything. And one day I went back, I took her back, I said, we need to go back to the old house and pick up the mail. So I went to the old house, and all the trees in the front yard had been cut down. And she started crying. And I said, Rebecca, what's the matter? She said, they cut our trees down. And I said, honey, those are not our trees. That's not our house anymore. And I was not being a thoughtful mother or therapist or anything. She was grieving that house that she knew as a child and kind of expected to stay like that. So even something small as that, and paying attention to that, I think, can be very helpful. Okay, another myth, and I'll throw this out as a question, is that there's a good way, there's a proper way to grieve. And come on in. Hi. There's a right way to grieve, a wrong way to grieve. So what are some things you learned, maybe from your parents, from your community, even from your church, your co-workers, about what's the right way to grieve? What's a good way to grieve? Anyone?
You always hear about the 5 steps or the 7 steps or...
Okay, you hear about those. Okay, and actually that's Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross actually was talking about the 5 stages of acceptance of a terminal illness. So she was really talking about what people go through as they're facing terminal illness. It's not really, it's applied to grief, but it's not really accurate. Some people are told, to show a strong face, not show their emotions. Other people are told to, that's okay. The thing I want to say is there really is no right or wrong way to grieve. It's a very individual matter. I would say the only thing that would be wrong is if some people, again, as a therapist, I run into that, people are using alcohol and other substances not to think about grief. Or they become so busy that they don't allow themselves to have any time to process those feelings. To me, those would be the only times that I would worry about somebody who's just not allowing themselves at all. So the other thing we've learned over time is that, people grieve very differently, and that's affected by things like your culture, your religion, your age, your sex. There's often men and women tend to show grief in different ways. And that can be really hard when perhaps a couple loses a child, because the woman and the husband and the wife, who are both parents of that child, may show their grief in very different ways. And sometimes that causes problems even between the parents. There was a movie I watched one time that was really a beautiful, beautiful representation in an Alaskan community where there had been a death in the community, and the men, or one of the men, was outside carving a totem pole, and that's what he did every day. He went out there, and that was a totem pole he was making in memory of the person who died, and that's how he was working on his grief. He wasn't necessarily talking about it or crying or those kinds of things we associate. So people grieve differently. People take different amounts of time. There's a phrase that I like to use about grief, and that is, how long does grief take? Grief takes as long as it takes. There isn't like, okay, after a year, you should be back on track. Or at work, if you work for a corporation, you might get 3 days of bereavement, and then you're expected to come back and be, ready to go again. I think what I found and we find in the work is that really what happens is over time, the pain kind of diminishes. It doesn't maybe ever entirely go away. So people can, 10 years later, see something or even smell something or go to the grocery store and pick up a food item and think, oh, Dad would have really liked this, and have a very strong feeling. But it isn't a thing that's going on day after day. So that would be one of the ways. So any questions or comments? Or, yes?
I found, when I lost my mother, I was crying a lot.
Yeah.
Every 5 minutes thinking about it. And I found that after a while, the grieving meant, it didn't occur to me in 5 minutes.
Yes.
It lessened the amount of
Yes,
times
yes.
she popped up in my head and hit me again.
Absolutely.
So it's always there, it's still there.
Yeah, yeah.
But it doesn't happen every 5 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very good explanation of that, is that even 20 years from now, again, you can be, something can hit you unexpectedly and it can feel like it was just yesterday. But people ask that, when is this going to ever get over? And in a sense, sometimes I tell people, there's a way in which you don't really want it entirely to get over, because if you don't have those feelings and you don't think those things, then there's something missing there too. You know, it's just that it isn't all day, every day. The first day you can wake up after a major loss and go through the whole day and think, I didn't think about her all day. You know, it's kind of a surprise. Just for a quick note too, though, is that once people start to realize that I'm not thinking about her or him in the same way, there is a term that we use called survivor's guilt, where people can start to think, oh, am I letting my loved one down by not thinking about them? You know, that I wasn't as upset today. But that's part of healing. That's part of healing. And then later those feelings can come again. And I really welcome for people to feel okay about sharing those feelings, because that's how you work through the grief. Yes?
My mother has been gone for, I don't know, probably 30 years, but I miss her still, of course. And just, maybe 6 or 7 months ago, my grief is, I worry about forgetting her face.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Just remembering the physicality
Yeah.
of her. And so I prayed that something would happen that would help me not to forget that. And I had some kind of a dream that was amazing. It was like her face was just right in front of me, as clear as could be. And I woke up feeling very happy, actually,
That you had that gift.
experience.
Yeah.
Because part of grief is you really don't want to forget.
And you don't want to lose anything you had of that person. That's thank you for sharing that. That's a very common reaction, a very heartfelt. The other things too, people talk about, so this is not crazy, is, let's say your spouse died, is I still kept some of his clothes. I still want to have the smell of this person near me. And when I don't want to wash those clothes. And when the smell fades away, that's another loss. And now that people don't have landlines anymore so much, but people would have, I had somebody talk about their daughter or something had a message on the phone, right? Hello, this is such and such, please get back to me. Well, the person was gone, but they didn't want to erase that message, because that was the thing. Every time when you call, you hear that message. So all those kinds of things, those are grief. Those are natural. Those are our body and our soul and our spirit trying to adjust to something that's devastating that we really don't want to adjust to. But yeah, the sight, the smells. We could talk about dreams too. I mean, that's another thing. I've had a lot of people talk about dreams as very positive in that way of somehow being reassuring. But then other people will say, but I don't ever dream about him. And that makes me sad too. So, I don't think there's, again, a rule for that. So, thank you. Those are great comments. Yeah.
So I kind of have like this opposite problem. I'm coming up on the year anniversary of my
Yeah.
husband's death. And we retired and left our house. So all those things happened. And then my mother-in-law recently passed away, and then my father-in-law as well. But I have a hard time crying.
Okay.
And everyone says like it's cathartic and you should do it and it's good, and it's really hard for me to do.
Okay.
And so I don't know.
No, I don't think you can make yourself cry. I mean, I think some people that's a more natural, I think you will find other ways to grieve. We'll talk about this, but one of the things that might really help is just to do some writing about the things you're feeling. Again, people will make suggestions to you, like, you're crying too much, you're not crying enough, or whatever. Those might be good for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing for you. Especially because I did a lot of groups with people who lost a spouse. When you've lost a spouse, people will give you all kinds of suggestions, like clean out the house, give his clothes away, don't give his clothes away. how come I'll come over next weekend and we'll clean the closets out. That might be okay for you and helpful, and maybe you want to keep the closet just the way it is. So one of the most poignant things somebody told me is, I just couldn't throw away his wallet because you have so much of your life in that wallet. For me personally, the last time I went into my mom's room and I saw her purse was still on the chair, that really, really got to me, because until the very end, whenever we went out, she always said, let me take my purse, let me take my purse. And even when her dementia was pretty bad, she would insist on paying, and somehow or other, my daughter said, she's adding this up right. But it was so important to her to do that, to pay for dinner and to have her purse. And that just represented so much of what she wanted to do for us. So when I saw her purse just sitting there and saying she's not using that purse again, sometimes those small things actually bring out that feeling even more than this bigger idea of the person's gone. So the purse. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit, as I said, we tend to talk about Kubler-Ross as the model for grief, but we have a model that was pioneered by a psychiatrist in Harvard, and it's I think, a very useful way to look at grief. It's not a stage thing, like you go through this, and then you have to go through this, and so on. It's called tasks of grieving. So it's a way of looking at what are some of the things psychologically, spiritually, physically we need to accomplish to kind of get through grief. So I think this is a useful way. And the first task of grief is really just to acknowledge the loss, that this really has occurred. And this sounds like kind of an obvious thing, but by acknowledge the loss, that means you really know, body, soul, and mind, that this person is gone. So people will say, I know my mom's gone, but the phone rings and I think, oh, there she is, she's calling me. Or you hear a car pull up into the driveway and, oh, that's Dad home. And so there is a part of you that still doesn't entirely believe that. I hope Jim doesn't mind, but his father died of a heart attack, and it was a very sudden death. This is another one of those little things, those grief things. We still had a letter from Dad on the coffee table that we just opened up. We're reading, it was still sitting there. And then his dad died suddenly of a heart attack. We found out this, and a couple days later I found him in the garage, and he was really kind of shaken, and he said, I'm not going to be able to see my dad before they cremate, and that was a really difficult thing for him. I think we kind of, when we are able to be with somebody through the whole process. I also wasn't there when my mom died. We'd been going down every single weekend, and they said, she's okay. The hospice nurse said, she's actually doing pretty well. They called me in the afternoon and said that. I said, okay, well, we're going to come this weekend. Well, she died that night. So, but if we're able to be there through the process, as difficult as that is, Joy's a nurse and knows about this, there is something that is helpful about that. I've heard so many people tell me that taking care of my mom or my husband or my daughter or whoever it was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm so glad I did it. And I do think the grief that comes out of that is maybe a different quality than you're going about your life and all of a sudden you get a phone call and everything's changed. It's really hard to accept. So acknowledging the loss, that this really has happened, and that body, mind, and soul, that takes time. That's not something that happens as soon as you get the phone call. That's something that takes. The other thing about why 10 years later and 20 years later it matters is because things change in your life too. Like our first grandson was born 2 years ago, and I know my mother would have liked to see him. And all these things that are going to happen, I can't even tell her about them. So there are things you don't even think about now that happen that you'd want to share with this person, and then you'll remember that again. That memory will come up. And PJ, you're talking about multiple loss. When there is multiple loss, sometimes what happens is it gets so overwhelming that people don't even know for sure what I'm grieving at this moment. And that is really difficult. We have mission teams, as you do, that go to the fires and the hurricanes and so on. And when people, just 20, 30 people have died and lost their house, it's just so much you almost can't deal with it. So that's especially difficult. The second task of grieving is feeling the feelings of grief. And that's the thing I think in some ways is the hardest. It's the thing we don't want to do, because those feelings are difficult. Those feelings are difficult. But I try to tell people sometimes that they're difficult kind of in proportion to the relationship you had. They're difficult because you had that close of a relationship. I do want to say, though, that you can have had a difficult relationship with the person who died and still be grieving, You can divorce someone and be glad in one sense that you're divorced, but still be grieving, okay? Because you're still grieving the life you hoped you had. When you got married, you made promises to each other and you were hoping to have that life. So even though it's best that you are separated now, you can still be grieving when there's a divorce. When someone you care about dies but there's unfinished business, that's also really difficult. So for me, with my dad, it was more of a unfinished business. There was a lot of stuff that he wouldn't talk about. I never found out from him. And, that comes up occasionally today too. What did he think about this? But if you have a conflicted relationship with that person, good and bad, you can also be grieving. You can be grieving that I can't work these things out anymore with them. That can be what your grief is. So the feelings that we experience in grief, actually I did grief groups for a lot of years, and we would spend like a whole session on some of these feelings. What are the feelings that you know of that are common to grief? Emptiness. Mm-hmm. Anger. Regret. Yeah. Okay, so those are actually the big ones. We spent a whole session talking about anger, and we tell people it's okay to discuss your anger. Okay, your anger might be at the pastor. Your anger might be at other people in your church who were there, great for the funeral, put all the food together, were so loving and stuff, and then 2 weeks later, you're sitting at the back of the church and no one's paying any attention to you. I'm not saying that happens in the churches we go to, but I know people have talked about that, a sense of betrayal, that here's my church family, and I thought I was getting all the support, and then I, 2 weeks later, I'm back to, nobody paying any attention. People are often angry at doctors. Doctors far often more than nurses, but doctors. You can be angry with the people at the mortuary, angry at, all kinds of people involved. Do you think you could be angry at the person who died? No. Yeah. Not everybody is, but sometimes people are. I think especially, for example, if you had a spouse who didn't take care of themselves, smoked, wouldn't watch their cholesterol, wouldn't go to the doctor, all those kinds of things, and then they died, you might feel angry at that person for leaving you here in the situation, okay? And then I think, again, unfortunately, people are told, oh, you shouldn't be angry at them. You know, they're gone. But that is a real feeling, too. You could just sort of have a general feeling of, you could feel angry at the world, right? You could feel angry at God. How could God let this thing happen, right? And hopefully you're in a church community where you can voice that anger and you can be greeted in that anger. So that anger is a pretty common feeling. Some people say, oh, I'm not angry at any of those people, but I'm really short with the people in line. There's just an irritation. I just don't have the same kind of patience I had. The other thing that I think is really hard to talk about, you could be angry or just find it hard to be around people who have what you don't, you know. I mean, women, for example, who've had miscarriages or haven't been able to have a successful pregnancy, when they see people with, okay, so I was working with somebody who was not able to conceive, and she said her friend was just telling her very blithely, oh yeah, I'm pregnant again, and I don't even really want to be, you know, like it's my third kid, you know, we didn't really plan it, but oh, okay. So that's something that happens. I think, unfortunately, again, still in this society, especially when you're a woman and you become a widow, a lot of people sort of feel like they're a little bit off the radar. You know, they're a fifth wheel, or they are not welcome in the same way in social gatherings. So these are just things that we can think about. The other huge feeling that's very, very common is regret and guilt. And I like to explain there are two kinds, really, of guilt. One of them is guilt at things we really did that we wish we hadn't, or, you know, something we wish we had done differently. And the other kind of guilt is stuff that we couldn't possibly have known. If I had known that was going to be his last day, then I would have done X, Y, and Z. But there's no way you could know that. So, but we feel both of those. So again, a story from my family is that my father had always wanted to go to Europe. And so they were talking about it, putting it off. And my mother looked into some trips and stuff, and finally she found this one trip, and she said, oh, but he could never go on that trip, he's too slow, he wouldn't be able to get off on the bus. And I said, well, you know, maybe you should try that, that's the last possible chance. Well, after she kind of didn't pursue that, then it became clear that he never would be able to take a trip. Maybe he could have done that one. And so she did feel badly about that. So would anyone be willing to share any common feelings of regret that people might have? It doesn't have to be you personally. Things you've heard of?
Well, for years I wanted to make a cookbook of all my mom's recipes, and I didn't get it done. But I have her recipes, and we're still talking as a family about putting it into a book. And I keep thinking, but why didn't I take the time to do it when she was alive, so she could get the honor?
She could see it, she would have been so proud, yeah. And that sounds like a small thing, but that's such a huge thing. That's exactly the feeling that I'm talking about. And sometimes that is such a difficult feeling to think, I wish I had done that. I wish I had done that at the time.
My mother became senile, and I didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah.
She became very possessive of my father and very selfish about, you know, no interference with their relationship and all of this. And I was angry with her till the day she died.
Oh, yeah.
Because
She was keeping you out of, yeah,
Well, not so much that, but what I thought was selfish behavior toward my father.
yeah,
And it's hard to explain,
yeah.
but I always wish that I could go back and have been better son.
Oh, okay, thank you for, that is, and I think we can all probably, even if we haven't had that same experience, we can relate to that. Again, I'm happy to talk about my own life because I think that's how we learn from each other. I regret too, my father had Alzheimer's before my mother did, and again, I did not know the same things, and there were times that I, kind of yelled at him or was impatient with him, and he didn't know what he was doing. He went once into the refrigerator and he took out a bottle of soy sauce and he drank it because he thought it was Coke. So, but he, yes, I regret some of the things I said to him too, and I appreciate you sharing that. That is another one of those huge losses that unfortunately we are facing more and more of, is watching family members with cognitive problems, Alzheimer's. That's a loss, right? When that person may still be very much alive, but they are not the person that you knew. Sometimes their whole personality can actually change as a result of the disease. And so somebody who's been pretty calm and loving and cooperative becomes difficult. That's the disease, that's not the person. But it's hard to see the difference. So that's a huge form of grief. Yeah. Yeah.
My father who raised me was a much older man. He was 50 when I was born. And he died when he was 70, so I was just 20 years old. And then you realize, I really never even knew the man. I never went out on a drive with him. I never went on a vacation with him because he worked so hard trying to raise a family and didn't know him at all.
Yeah, and you wish there had been an opportunity to do that. Yeah, thank you.
I was going to say, with regard to dementia, my mother, we could see the signs, and then she fell, broke her hip, went into had her hip replaced and everything, and then after that, it took 4 years, and she just passed away about a year ago.
Yeah.
But it was almost like a grieving process for me that I don't think I really realized I was going through, watching her,
Yeah.
the stages. She was on the East Coast, so I would go back frequently, but I would see the marked changes because
Each time, especially because you weren't there every day. Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, so
Yeah.
I think one of the things I regret the most is that those 4 years, I didn't have an opportunity to talk, to have a real conversation with
Yeah.
her. That may have, there were no pearls of wisdom. She couldn't impart anything on me, and I couldn't share with her
Mhm.
because it was kind of a blank stare.
Sure is. Yeah.
So it was,
Yeah, and that's such a good point again, is really to remember that grief is not just something that happens when someone dies. So someone diagnosed with Alzheimer's, that is a moment of grief right there when you're looking at the future. When she can't do this anymore, when she can't remember who you are. I mean, what is more sad than that? The thing that makes me feel good, though, is there are stories about that basically someone might say, I don't remember who you are, but I know you're someone I love. And to remember that that's possible, that people may, or confuse you with a parent of theirs or any of those things. But I want to believe and hold on to the hope that there is still, that love is still, discernible, and that we can still share that with people, even if they can't, put a name to us or any of those things. So, did someone else have a, yeah.
Well, with my parents, I went through years of serious health problems, but they were always very cognitive
Okay.
mentally. I
Yeah,
didn't have
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But their health was, especially when mother one time, when I was going through with some trials of my own, and I really was grieving because I wanted to be able to talk to her.
Oh, and you,
And I felt like it would be a burden and I didn't want her to
Yeah.
have my burden.
And yet you lost that mothering part of her
Right,
that if she didn't have those things, you
Yeah.
know she would have
Yeah.
provided, yeah.
And
Yeah.
eventually, I did, you know, she was always very intuitive, so she knew something was going on with me.
Uh-huh.
And so,
She came to you?
very briefly, we had discussion, and I was able to reassure her that you raised me well, I'll be able to take care of it.
Oh, what a gift you could give her at that moment
Yes,
then.
but
And,
I felt so guilty, you know, putting my problems on her
um,
when she was in that
Yeah.
condition.
Wow.
But yet, I needed my mother.
you needed your, we all need Mother God, we need mothering, all of us, even if we don't have living mothers, right? We need that sense that somebody loves us that unconditionally and understands us. So you were seeking that. I think that was
Yeah.
totally understandable, and thank you. So
So it's hard to know what to do in that.
yeah, I know, it's
I
hard.
don't know what your suggestions are.
I have to think about that. But again, I don't want to be just, you know, depressing everybody. I also like to share that part of the reason I like to do grief is because I think there is real transformation that can happen in these moments. People used to say, why do you want to do that as your specialty? Isn't that depressing? I said, well, you haven't really done it, so you don't know the opportunities there are in grief. So one of the things, I'll just share this story with you, and it's also a model for how maybe to handle some of these things. I had a group of widowers. It was mostly men, which is very rare. It's usually women that come to these groups, but this was mostly men. And we were talking about regrets, and the next week this guy came in to the group and he brought a card, and he said, I want to read this card to you. You'll want to read it out loud to the group. And he said, Dear Mary, or whatever her name was, he said, you know, for 40 years, you made our house and our home what it was. You're the one who spent hours decorating for Christmas. You're the one who made the Easter ham. You're the one who took care of all the children's gifts. You're the one who, you know, dragged out the Christmas tree. And you know something I never really appreciated? I never thanked you. In all those years, I took it for granted that you were doing this and you loved it, and I certainly loved and appreciated it, but I never thanked you for it. So here, right now, in this group, I'm offering my thanks and my recognition of what you did to make our life together. And so even though he couldn't tell that to her, he told it to the group, and the group was obviously, you know, very appreciative of hearing it, and I think it helped him to do that. I think that really helped him heal something. So again, as a therapist, and I'm a writer, I really encourage people to write. If you have something you want to tell your mom even now, you can write it now. Just putting it down on paper makes it different than just something in your head. You can say, I know you can't hear this at some level, but at some level you can, and this is what I want you to know. So, guilt, and the third, let's see, we're I'll go through this a little more quickly. The third part that we really talk a lot about in grief groups is called adjusting to the environment without the lost, you know, the loss that we've had. And that is just sort of really how do you live day to day. Obviously, if the person was your spouse, that's the most immediate impact because they're not there anymore. They're not home. Every time, one of my clients said, every time I walk into the house, I would look at all the, he did everything in the house. You know, he spent hours putting all this fancy woodwork to store, you know, our treasures. And every time I look at around in the living room, I see this. It's both a, you know, a warm feeling and a sad feeling at the same time. If again, it's a parent or somebody you don't see as often, then your day-to-day life can be going on as normal, but you still have that loss there, right? So how do you adjust to that environment? One of the things that we do talk about, and I think somebody brought it up, is how do you deal with anniversaries? How do you deal with holidays? Churches often have some help around how do we handle this holiday? Because a holiday, especially Christmas, everybody's supposed to be so joyful, and it's a family time, and if you don't have family to get together, how do you handle that? There are two kinds of difficult days. One of them is the public days, like Christmas, Thanksgiving. You're at work and people say, hey, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? Oh, I'm going to my mom's. And so I'm in a writing group, and somebody was just sharing a story about somebody else. They were at a kid's sports game, and somebody was sitting next to her and complaining, oh, that's mom again. Why is she bugging me now? And this woman was thinking, how I wish I could have mom bug me right now, you know. So the public kind of holidays where everybody knows, what are you doing for Easter? Are you having people over? Are you having your grandchildren over? Are you taking your mom out for Mother's Day? Those days everybody knows, and they're difficult because of that. The other days, though, that are hard are the days that people don't know, like the anniversary of the person's death, like that person's birthday. You know, that's something other people won't know. This would have been my, husband's 75th. This would have been our 30th wedding anniversary. Nobody else will know that. Let's say you go to work. Nobody has the slightest idea that you're carrying that. So again, in groups and in therapy and stuff, I encourage people to talk about maybe have a plan for that day. Maybe sometimes people find it's helpful to, one story, this is a beautiful story, somebody whose child died at Children's. They decided that on the anniversary of their child's death, they would bring a birthday party to Children's Hospital for the kids. So that kind of thing can turn into, as I said, this really, loving and, it's not to say they weren't sad doing this, but that made a huge difference for them. So how do you handle those days? And then I'll just go on. The final task of grieving is called reinvesting in new relationships. And that doesn't necessarily mean dating again. What I take that to mean is that love that you had for that person, that doesn't just die when the person dies. You really are working through grief when you find other places to share that love. So that is the final and very hopeful task of grieving. You have some Bible verses. The thing I do want to talk about too is what do you say when you know somebody's had a loss? What do you say? Put you on the spot. Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
You don't say much, you listen.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Sometimes that is the best thing you can do, is just, I'm here to listen. I'm here, but unfortunately, people who've had a major loss will tell you over and over again, I hear so many things I wish I hadn't heard. Just even the thing like if you lost, you're young, you can have more kids. You had a miscarriage, a stillbirth, you can have more children, you're young. Or someone died who'd been sick for a long time. He's in a better place, he's not suffering anymore. Okay, that's true. That doesn't mean I'm not suffering. So those kinds of phrases, while they may be what I would call theologically sound, God's taking care of him, he's in heaven, whatever, are not comforting generally for people. So yes, the idea that I'm here to listen to whatever you want to say, I think may be the simplest and best thing. And also not, I know what you're going through, okay? Because you probably don't really. Even if you lost your mom too, you did not lose the same mom I did. So there are things we can share, but to just say, oh, I know what you're going through, I know what you're going really the simplest thing is I'm here, I care about you, I'm here to listen. The other thing is, I would suggest don't say something like, let me know if I can do anything for you, okay? Because people cannot think of things to do. You know, that puts the burden back on them, and then they feel like, you know, that was, I think what's much more practical and useful, say something like, well, you know they have kids or something, can I get your son to soccer for this season or something, or, you know, something substantial and practical, rather than, let me know if I can help. Let me know if I can help tends to be something that people don't really take too seriously, because it doesn't really mean things.
I just went through that situation this weekend with one of my favorite cousins that has been diagnosed with MS.
Oh, okay.
And I was on the phone with my other cousin with her, and I told her, I said, Carol, I'm angry at you because you didn't let me know about this. And she knew I wasn't angry with her.
Yeah.
And then she teased me back, you know, and then the rest of our conversation was just like as if we would, you know, just be on a casual phone call again.
Okay.
And that seemed to work well for both of us.
Okay, yeah, that was the right answer, yeah. But again, the simplest thing to do is be a comforting, loving presence to somebody. And that is so needed. And you feel like you have to say something, you have to have the right thing to say or something. Most of the time, there isn't a right thing to say, so.
Our son died, he was in an automobile accident when he was 22. And we had a memorial service a week later in our backyard. People came, we thought we'd have it in the house. More people came and our yard was full of people. And what was so wonderful about that, there were a lot of his friends we invited comments from anybody who wanted to say anything. And I learned more about my son and what kind of a person he was that I didn't see as he came in, shut the door, hi Mom, I'm going, bye Mom, you know, that sort of thing. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I have to say I treasure those comments, and I always will, because that to me was what made him,
So special.
that was his soul.
Yeah, and people share that. That is a wonderful, yeah, a wonderful idea as a way. The opposite of that, though, again, when we're talking about what to do, what not to do, what I think people really find difficult is when nobody will talk about the person who died. They think that they're sparing your feelings by not mentioning them, you know. But most of us or if we're going through something difficult, I mean, we may not want to talk about it, so if somebody just gently says, how's it going with such and such, say, I can't really talk now, but I think most of us feel good that somebody asked. When people act like nothing's happened, nothing's happening, I don't want to make you upset by bringing it up, you actually feel more rejected and more alone, in general, okay, that, not everybody in every case, but those are just some tips. So I think we're kind of coming to the end of the hour. And any other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
Me?
Yes.
I just lost one of my very good friends that I grew up with. And he was funny, he was crazy, he was a wackadoo, you know. And he always made everybody laugh, and he actually saved my life in a car accident.
Wow.
When we were kids in high school, and he was raised in a Jewish household. And so I was raised in a Catholic household. And so we always loved each other, you know what I mean, like just as buddies, you know. But we had different faiths, and I would go to his house and share his faith, and he would come to my house and share my faith. And it was awesome. And then about 30 years ago, he became a completed Jew, where he was, you know, believed in Jesus, and it was about the same time as my transformation and, you know, accepting Jesus and going through, so we were both going through rough times, you know, so we reconnected. And see him, he lived up in Puget Sound. And I had gone up to see him, and we had seen each other and spent a lot of time on the phone and everything. And he would always call to encourage me with scripture. And I'm divorced and single, so it was just
That kind of bond, that's, yeah, yeah.
you know, a man that loved the Lord, that loved me,
Yeah.
but it was so unconditional.
Yeah, and so unreplaceable, right? There's no way that you can have that person again ever, yeah.
So his sister said, you know, if you can come and see him, I know Brian would love to see you. So I went up the week before they were bringing him home because he was on hospice. And everything happened so fast. It was just like 1 week I heard about it, and the
Yeah,
next
the
week
next
they had him
one,
in
yeah,
hospice.
yeah.
And so I went up there and stayed 3 days. And the Lord told me to fast and pray and just be with him.
Mhm.
And he recognized
Oh.
that we even stayed.
Yeah, yeah,
That God had sent me up there to be with him.
absolutely, that was where you were supposed to be.
And it was the thing, I've never experienced anything like this. He talked about the pain, he talked about the suffering, but he also talked about identifying with this Christ and suffering that he was going through.
Wow.
And he was not, he said, Karen, you know, yeah, pray for me, because I wanted to pray for a miracle,
Yeah,
a healing miracle.
yeah,
So I was praying along for my, you know, not my healing, but his healing miracle, you know? But it was like all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit kind of said, it's not about what you want, it's between him and the Lord.
Mhm.
And it's not really your business to do that. I mean, you can pray for him, but God's will will be done.
God will
Not my
take care,
will.
yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, and maybe, honestly, even that praying you did was for your benefit.
Yeah, maybe. it
Yeah,
was.
was to help you start to heal and deal with this loss.
You know, I feel like he saved my life, and I wanted to go.
Yeah, I can understand that, yeah. Well, I think the fact he knew that you wanted that is extremely powerful. Thank
So,
you.
Yeah, that was,
Wow.
and to see someone go through it with their faith and so strong in their faith was
Mhm.
such an example to me.
Okay.
And they asked me to speak at his service.
Oh.
And I could talk, I mean, it was hard to talk, but I
You,
just.
you were led to
It was the
talk.
Holy Spirit, and it was just like,
Oh.
I couldn't do it on my own. I just, you know, had to stop a few times and just say, God, help me do
But you got,
Get it out.
yeah, you did, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and again, at this point, be gentle with yourself. Give yourself permission to feel sad, to have questions, to talk to other people, to be silent, whatever it is you need. Because that's a tremendous, tremendous loss.
And you know that the interesting thing that when you were saying that grief comes in sweet,
Yeah, yeah,
I think what it did was it opened me up to the grief I've never grieved
Yeah.
before.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
all the other,
Yeah.
I lost
Okay.
my mom, you
Yeah.
know, my
Yeah.
daughter, you
Yeah.
know, I was very young when I lost my mom. You know, all those things.
Yeah, yeah.
It kind of opened the door for
It
all
opened
of
up,
it.
and that unfortunately, or fortunately, if we think God is leading us in this, does happen sometimes. We store those griefs up, and then something like this kind of lets them all out. You know, people on battlefield or something that can't grieve at the time, this might come later. So thank you so much. It's an inspiring story you're telling us, and for the courage to kind of say it out loud in a group you don't know. I really appreciate that.
It was,
Yeah.
to me, it was an honor to be there.
Oh,
You know, it really was an
yeah,
honor to be
yeah.
there.
Well, you
And
honored his
to
spirit,
see
yeah.
how strong he was in God, and it just really, it was very inspiring that
Yeah.
he was not afraid.
Well, and it kind of gives you that
Yeah.
security too. That's another gift he gave you.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what I felt like my mom. That's what I said at her little memorial. I said, you taught us how to die, because she really
Wow.
She just kind of was very, the last time I saw her, just kind of peacefully moving into this time. She had been a person who would complain about all kinds of things and remember all kinds of things when her mind was working, but after this point, in one way, there was a gift of forgetting a lot of those difficult things in her life and just appreciating if you came and brought her some M&Ms or some, she liked potato chips still to the end, and she just would appreciate and smile and love those things, and that was a gift that we had that kind of time.
Of course, at my age, I've seen all sorts of death and, relatives, many.
Yeah.
My father died 9 years ago, and that was incredibly hard. And my mother's 87, and I swear to you, I'm going to be in a straitjacket when she goes. I am just so afraid
Okay,
of that loss. She's my best friend,
yeah,
and, so part of showing up tonight for me is in preparation,
getting this, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I just, I think, do a lot of people feel that way? It's
Well, and don't, again, that's another myth, that because somebody was 95 and they died, that we wouldn't grieve because they've lived that whole long life. Well, they have lived that, we've had them here for so long. In Asian culture, we actually believe that older people dying is sadder than younger people dying. I don't know, do they believe in Korea too? Yeah, because older people have this wealth of all these experiences and stuff. A baby, we think in this culture, a baby dying is the hardest thing. But in Asian cultures, we think a senior dying is the hardest thing, because they have all this wealth of knowledge, all this experience and stuff you can't replace. So,
Well, it's tough because, I don't know, sometimes I just wonder what was God thinking? It's like, you're gonna give me my mom for 60-something years, and then I'm supposed to live happily ever after?
yeah.
And she goes? That's just not fair.
And when our last parent dies, we become the generation. There is nothing between us.
Right.
That's another part of it. But ultimately, what I would just say to you, hope as a sign of hope, it's not going to be easy, but ultimately, if you can know the way she's living in you, that will help you get, when you start to see her living through you,
Yes,
and you are aware of it,
that's right.
that will help. But the feelings and all of that stuff is, you're right, it's gonna be hard. There's no way around it.
Well, and it gives me faith that, there's many of you around me who have lost both of your parents, and you're not in a straitjacket. So.
Thanks for that.
Okay, I think we should finish up so that we, wait a minute, I would like you, to tell you what I have here. One of the things I have is a page called Grief Resources, so there are a lot of really good grief groups in the area, and I encourage people to use those. And a lot of the churches offer grief groups. And I have some other suggestions on working through grief in here too. And what I'd like to finish with is actually from the Reformed Judaism prayer book. And I will read a line, and then maybe we can all say the stanza, which is "We remember them." This is called "We Remember Them." And again, we can keep in our hearts the people that we mourn. And in the rising of the sun and in its going down, in the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, in the opening of buds and in the warmth of summer, in the rustling of leaves and the beauty of autumn, in the beginning of the year and when it ends, when we are weary and in need of strength, when we are lost and sick at heart, when we have joys we yearn to share, so long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as. Okay, thank you. And actually in Judaism, this is a very important concept of keeping those memories alive. So I thank all of you and invite you to, cherish those memories and keep all of those people alive in your hearts.
Thank you, Claire, for your wonderful presentation and the exciting and stimulating Q&A in between. We all experience grief one way or another with varying degrees. That's what I believe motivated us, you and me, to come here. Psalm 130 begins with a cry. Out of depth I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. But the reason why we came here is not to contemplate on the grief we bear or pity ourselves in our suffering, but to find the ways in which we not only manage grief, but also find grace and future. In this hope, psalmist continues, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits. And in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning, more than those who watch for the morning. I hope this event has shown us a sign of the morning light dawning, and has left with us a sign of God's unending grace and love. Amen.